So let's create our own custom service using the utilities that AngularJS provides. So the syntax for creating our own service, that is a singleton object which will contain properties and functions or methods, is pretty simple. It's going to be attached to my app. Doesn't pollute the global namespace. It's inside that app module. And I just do my app.service. And I give the service a name. I'm going to call this name service because I'm going to use it just to connect up where I type in my name, let's say. Again, notice that we have myapp.config, myapp.service, and various myapp.controllers. So these are all underneath this app module. Inside then, after you put the name, you place the function that will contain really the object or all of the methods and properties that you want in your service. So for example, I can say this.name and give it a default value. Now this will be an accessible property on this singleton object. I can also do a method like, let's say, name length. And I can make that a function. Now we'll have to do a little bit of JavaScript trickery, because if I do this, the keyword this inside the function will refer to this function. We want it to refer to this function. So I can do a common pattern, which is give a variable self equal to this. So now I have a reference to this function. And then I just do self.name.length, and I'll return that. So here's my simple service. It has a name and name length. That's easy enough. Now, how do I get access to my service inside my controllers? Well, actually, you do it the exact same way you get access to every other service: dependency injection. I gave my service a name. So all I have to do is inject that name into my controller, and I'll have my singleton object. Let's watch. I'll log name service.name. And I'll go ahead also and log name service.name length. Let me run this. It opens up our single page app, and then I'll open the console, and what do I see? Oh, that's a mistake actually. See, but there's the service, and then I toStringed the function. Remember, JavaScript functions are converted to strings unless you call them. Let me call it, refresh. There. John Doe, that's 8 characters, including the space, and there's my length. So AngularJS took care of the dependency injection for me. I defined my service, and I injected it. And it's just that easy. So what would I want to do with the service? Well, it's a singleton. So this is where you're taking advantage of single-page applications. Remember that normally when you're dealing with JavaScript, if I was to move from page to page, I would lose my JavaScript variables. The page would change, would blink, it'd be a completely new HTTP request and a download, and I get an all new space of memory for the JavaScript. But because I'm inside a single page application, even though I'm navigating from page to page, I'm still inside the same JavaScript memory space. I have all the variables and content and values that I had when I started, even after I navigate. So that means I can share content across pages, as well as use the services to encapsulate functionality that I use across different controllers. So let's take a quick look at how we would use this, perhaps. So I'll go into my main controller, and I've injected name service, and I have this scope.name already, and instead of setting it to a string value like that, I'm going to go ahead and set it equal to nameService.name. See that? So I'll be making this value, this initial value, available by setting a scope value on it. And I'll just go over here, and instead of outputting it, I'll actually bind it to a text box. So I'm going to use ng-model and name. So I'll use that, and I'll just copy and paste this and put one of those, actually both of these, over on the second page. And I see ng-model equals name and ng-model equals name. So I'll just copy this as well and below here. And so I'm setting two scope variables equal. One name here and one name there, excuse me. So name service on both. There's actually a bug in this code. Do you see what it is? Well, we know that it's going to try to bind to both of these scopes, each of these pages, that name. But if I was to refresh this, see? Notice that this didn't get interpolated. Why? Because there was a bug in the JavaScript. It never ran. And it tells me name service is not defined. So what did I do wrong? I didn't inject name service. All right, so I'll inject name service. Now I should have that available to me. There we go. So see John Doe and John Doe. Now what happens if I change this value? Instead of John Doe, I'll put Jane Doe. Now that updated the scope, but remember the scope is not a singleton, so when I go over to the second page, it still pulls from what is in the service singleton. And my name service value was John Doe. When I go back, that's now lost because the controller code ran again. And it's reset the name equal to what came out of the service. So I need to update the service whenever the name changes. And you might be thinking, well, wait a minute. Shouldn't AngularJS and that digest loop be updating this for me? I realize, no, it's scope that AngularJS looks at. And there's nothing that wraps up and looks at where scope came from, where it got those values, and updates those as well. AngularJS doesn't have that kind of functionality. So we can do it, though. We just have to use something that AngularJS makes available to us. Do you remember what that is? To manually add a watch or a watcher and do some work when something changes. I do scope.watch, and I'm going to watch the name, so it's going to watch this property on the scope, and when that changes, because it will change when I change the text box, because it will throw an event, I'll just update nameService.name to whatever it is, to whatever that scope value has been updated to, because I changed the text box. So I've got a manual watch, and I'll put a watch over here as well. Now this may look kind of weird, but this is perfectly valid and something that you may end up needing to do in AngularJS, not often. But in these kind of situations, we want to update the value of the service, the singleton, every time this name gets updated by AngularJS's digest loop. And so what's going to happen now that I've done this, now that I'm watching this value and updating the singleton on both pages? Let's refresh. I'll change this to Jane and go to my other page. And look, Jane Doe. Why? Well, when I changed the value in the main controller, scope.name got updated, so it ran my watch and updated the singleton. And since there's only one of these, when I went to the second page, the object that got injected was the same one that has just been changed over here. So now, when I set scope.name on this controller to that value of the singleton, I got the value that was originally changed here. And now I should see vice versa. If I change it in the second page, I should see that change in the first page. So let me go and change this again. And we'll go James Doe. So the scope should now be updated. the scope for this controller, and it should have updated the service singleton, the name service, and when I go, there it is. Do you see what's happening? I'm sharing data and information across pages. Now, in old school HTML land, we'd have to do this with hidden input fields and query strings, and sometimes on the server in memory. But here we're just doing it on the person's computer or device, in their browser, in that memory, in the JavaScript. That's one of the great advantages of a single page application. I can share data and services across pages. And I can make a lot more pages and it will be shared across all of them because it's a singleton. Now if I change this to Jane and then refresh the page, what's going to happen? Well, now the whole browser context is reloaded and it starts all over, and so I'll be back to John. See that? So I lost all that JavaScript when I refreshed the page. So in a real-world application, you'll need to persist data. You could persist a service to a cookie or to something called local storage, or perhaps to the database, whatever the circumstances are. But although you may persist it elsewhere, you can still share the information via that JavaScript object. And that's all you really need to make services. You can make as many as you want, give it a name, give it properties and methods. You may need to use some kind of technique if you're making methods and referencing parameters outside of them. And then AngularJS allows you to inject that service according to the name that you made into its controllers. And you can use it from there. Whatever you want to use, it's up to you within the AngularJS approach to architecting your application. That's services inside of AngularJS, and particularly as part of a single page application. Oh, one other thing. When you're learning and reading about AngularJS, you'll hear about more than just services. You'll also hear about factories and providers. Now in this course, we're not going to cover factories and providers. Why? Well, because factories and services are basically the same thing. They're similar enough that if you know how to use a service, you can learn how to use a factory very easily. And provider, you'll rarely have to use. For most purposes, learning to use a service will be just fine. And it's the simplest form of the concept. So create your services, they'll become singletons, and inject them into your controllers. Let's move on.